kinds of intelligence are morally important? And what kinds of intelligence give moral standing, right? If we want to ask the question, what things have standing, whether all things have standing, what kind of standing are we talking about? So in order to get to that question, let's dive deeper into this problem that I've raised of what kind of morality machine morality could be. So let's go back to today's intelligent machines, and let's think about the kinds of capabilities that we know they have. So right now, it is possible to design a machine that can follow moral rules of behavior that are encoded symbolically by humans. So for example, we can encode a rule in a mall robot that it should avoid colliding with human bodies. And again, that's an example of encoding a moral rule that we think is important for moral reasons. But as Wendell has already explained, today's machines, today's robots have no conception of moral importance, no recognition of what it means for a rule to be a moral rule, as opposed to any other kind of rule. And in fact, they don't have a concept of bodies in the sense that we do. They simply have a mathematical representation that we have invented as a proxy for a human body. And we create a mathematical program that ensures that the robot will maintain a certain distance from anything that has that mathematical pattern. That's very different from seeing a human body, understanding why it matters, knowing why it's important to steer around it and not collide with it. And these are capabilities that today's systems don't have. So today's systems can follow moral rules, but they cannot follow them with moral understanding. Another thing, however, that machines today can already do is learn and adapt their behavior to optimize for what computer scientists call a utility function. So that's an encoded mathematically in a computer program, a goal or combination of goals that we regard as a proxy for a successful or a desirable outcome. So for example, the utility function in a game environment, like a video game, might be to maximize your score in the game. And a learning adaptive machine can be programmed to find novel ways to maximize that score. So in some sense, it's almost like the crow that I described, right? Learning a new way to solve a problem. And the problem is one that has existed in its environment all along, but it can find a new way to solve the problem. And we now have machines already that can do this, where we can set them the task, not tell them what rules to follow to succeed at the task, and then train them repeatedly in an environment with a reinforcement learning algorithm that will allow the machine to discover a new way of solving the task, often that humans would not even have thought of in advance. This was one of the impressive features of AlphaGo and later AlphaZero, that in playing games like chess, Go, and later the video game StarCraft, the advanced versions of these systems built by the company DeepMind were able to invent strategies for maximizing their utility function in the game that human players had not previously discovered. Alternatively, sometimes these systems will not discover a strategy that humans have known about for centuries. So it shows us that these systems do not simply mirror human thought processes, but rather enact intelligence in quite different and sometimes surprising ways. So sometimes they will fail to see things that are obvious to us. And sometimes they will discover solutions that are quite obscure and difficult for us to reach. But I want to ask a further question here. In all of these examples, there is a hard-coded, mathematically defined, singular goal that the system is optimizing for. Does that match what it means to be an intelligent human or a morally intelligent human? Is there a single score in life that we can say a successful and good human maximizes? Some philosophers have thought that perhaps there is, that perhaps something like happiness is the utility function that humans should optimize for themselves and for others, and that as much as we can rack up the score of happiness in terms of pleasure and the absence of pain, that we are winning the game, so to speak. And that's the moral theory called utilitarianism that John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham and others have put forward. So in addition to optimizing for a particular utility function or score in an environment, another thing that machines today can already do is classify and produce moral phenomena as long as we can give it a mathematically defined coded proxy for that moral value. So again, as Wendell said, and as I've reminded you, machines today don't have moral concepts. The concept of fairness or justice or compassion is not something that we know how to represent or capture computationally. But what we can do in many cases, and many computer scientists strive to get better at this, is to create a mathematical proxy or stand-in for the moral concept that will allow the system to produce that moral outcome, even though we don't actually have the ability to give the machine an understanding of the moral concept itself that the mathematical equation is standing in for. So let me give you a concrete example for this. Something like fairness is an incredibly important concept for human social behavior. And as I've mentioned, even non-human animals often use concepts of fairness in managing their societies and maintaining social harmony. And today, fairness is one of the most talked about and acutely concerning issues for artificial intelligence, because we've seen that artificially intelligent systems trained on large bodies of human-generated data often pick up patterns in that data that reflect human biases, human patterns of discrimination and unfair behavior. And because artificially intelligent machines have no concept of fairness, they will quite readily reproduce these patterns and see them, for example, as typical of successful task performance. And they may even amplify these patterns in their own outputs because the patterns seem to be non-random, seem to be significant, seem to be correlated with human performance, which is what these machines are programmed to replicate and even exceed at. So often we program these machines to perform a task just like us, only better. But if we perform that task in a way that's biased and discriminatory, that can mean that a machine picks up that pattern and tries to embody it even more consistently. And so we can actually get machines that are not just reflecting and mirroring our bias, they can actually amplify it and make it greater. So machine learning fairness is a field of research that today is exploding in computer science. And big companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon are having to pour resources into this kind of research to make sure that their machine learning processes and tools and products don't amplify unfair bias in society. And it turns out that's a really hard problem that no one has solved. We have some ways of identifying and sometimes reducing the bias that turns up in these algorithms, but we have no easy way of getting all of the bias out of these algorithms when they're trained on biased human data. Okay, so that's why fairness is such an important concept. But remember what I've said, there's no machine on the planet that knows what fairness is. So how can you tell a machine, be fair? Don't be unfair. This is not a concept that we can program. So what humans do is take a mathematical representation that can stand in for fairness in a particular context. A mathematical definition like statistical parity that ensures that different demographic groups receive the same distribution of benefits across a particular context, right? That no one group is disadvantaged in the benefits that the algorithm is assigning. But there are other contexts in which we think fairness doesn't mean everyone gets the same benefit. Sometimes fairness means the people, for example, who have greater need should get more of a benefit. If we were handing out food, for example, on a street corner, we would think the fairest thing might be to give the free food to those who are suffering from unemployment or homelessness, or children who aren't receiving an adequate nutritional diet at home. We might think those would be the fair beneficiaries to distribute food to, and not the wealthiest person in town who happens to pass through the scene, right? So statistical parity in this case would not be fair. So fairness means different things in different social contexts. So today, what we can do is, if we know the context, we might be able to find a mathematical definition that stands in for a moral concept for this very narrowly defined case. But that doesn't give us a lot of flexibility. What we don't have today are systems that can judge what fairness means in different contexts for different groups of stakeholders and for different outcomes. So moral flexibility, the ability to see how moral judgments need to be altered for different situations, that's something that we struggle today to even imagine how to build into artificially intelligent machines. So that leads us into this question of the unsolved hard problems for machine morality. So I've given you an outline, and I'll recap briefly, of what we already can get machines to do in the domain of artificial moral agency. We can already get them to follow moral rules that are encoded symbolically by humans, like don't run into a human body. The second thing we said we have already learned to do is to build machines that can not only follow moral scripts, but find new moral paths to solve well-defined tasks. And if we consider those tasks morally valuable, then what we have are systems that can find new routes, new ways of achieving things that we regard as morally important. And finally, we have the ability, although we are still struggling to get better at this, we have the ability to seek mathematical definitions that can serve as proxies for moral concepts that remain uncomputable, that remain indefinable by strictly mathematical formula. So we can look for mathematical proxies that in a particular context get us, in practical terms, behavior that we regard as sufficiently fair or safe or kind or trustworthy, even though we have no way of building a machine that knows what those goals are. Okay, so that actually gives us a lot of potential for today's machines to help us with moral tasks in the world. What we don't have today are systems that can be held morally responsible for their behavior, that are morally aware of what they're doing as moral behavior, that can recognize the difference between a moral concept and a non-moral concept, or that can be regarded as blameworthy for making a moral mistake. And we don't have machines that can reflect on their behavior, that can change the moral goals assigned to them, or that can critique the moral frameworks that we have provided to these systems to constrain their behavior. So what are the further capabilities that would be required if we were to be able to develop systems that could function as artificial moral agents and could be considered equivalent to full moral agents or moral persons in that stronger sense that we described at the beginning of this section. Well, here are some of the capabilities that we would need to see. And I want, as you go through these, to think about the fact that all of these are capabilities that the protagonist in the Spark Hunter file grapples with, either because she has newly acquired these capabilities or discovered their complexity and their difficulty, or experienced the subjective feelings that go along with having these capabilities, or is still striving to perfect these capabilities. So let's go through these and see why they matter for moral agency and personhood. The first is something we've already talked about, this notion of moral understanding, what Wendell called a semantic understanding of the moral universe. That's the ability to have a direct grasp of what we call thick moral concepts like fairness or justice or even goodness itself or virtue. And to be able to understand these concepts and apply them in contextually varied ways to see how what justice means in one situation means something very different in another. Furthermore, moral understanding means knowing something about the historical arc of these concepts, understanding how, for example, a term like justice has changed over time and across cultures. And the ability to recognize these concepts not as fixed mathematical formula, but as contested and socially negotiated ideals. So to really understand justice actually is not to understand a definition at all, but to understand something that human persons, are continually struggling to get better at characterizing, at reaching a consensus about. So to have machines that could function as full moral agents, we would need machines who could participate with us in constructing that understanding and negotiating that understanding. Imagine a machine that could argue with you about what is more just. Imagine a machine that could identify new and better ways to construct a just world. That would be a machine that would be a full moral agent. And we see in the Spark Hunter file the protagonist struggling to articulate her own emerging moral understanding of important concepts. We also see her struggle with the experience of empathy and understanding the proper extent of empathy. Empathy is the ability to not just intellectually understand others' feelings and states of mind, but also to be emotionally affected by those states of mind and feelings. So, for example, empathy requires the ability to both understand when another person is suffering, but also to be able to be moved by a kind of compassionate concern about that suffering, the ability to feel something when you see another being suffering. And in the Spark Hunter file, there is this a moment where she describes the experience of tending to an injured dog and describing the feelings of empathy that she found herself having to grapple with at that moment. But we often distinguish empathy, the ability to be affected by the emotions of others and to understand those emotions and feelings, from compassion, which is not a feeling but an action. Compassion is the movement towards the relief of suffering and the ability to act in ways that make the world less painful, more caring, more compatible with joy and happiness, and full moral agents that we would trust to care for our loved ones, to act in ways that respected the dignity of human life and other lives, not just human lives, we would expect those beings to be capable of compassion for life. And that's something that we don't know how to build into a machine. We barely understand what that capacity is in ourselves and how to encourage its growth in our own character. Another thing we think full moral agents have to have, and I've spoken briefly on this already, is responsibility, the ability to hold ourselves and one another accountable for moral consequences. One thing that many philosophers have thought that required is control over our actions, the ability to choose to do otherwise, right? So if I'm to be held responsible for something that I've done wrong, it seems like it should have at least been possible for me to not do that and to do the right thing instead. Otherwise, how can you blame me for doing the wrong thing if I had no choice? So what would it mean for a machine to have a choice? For a machine to be able to do something other than follow a program or optimize for a certain utility function? So we don't know how to build machines that can have real choices for which we could hold them accountable. Of course, there are philosophical debates about whether humans have these kinds of choices, whether we are truly as free as we imagine ourselves to be. Yet another thing that we require for full moral agency, as I've spoken about already, is moral learning and reflexibility. That's the ability to self-examine our moral character, to critique our own moral performance, to justify properly our own moral behavior, and to identify where it could improve. And so there are moments in the Spark Hunter file where the protagonist says, "I'm still learning." And we want to ask ourselves, what would it take for a machine to be able to reflect upon its own moral performance and strive to make it better, to critique it, and to figure out how to learn on its own to be more moral over time? And connected with that, finally, is practical wisdom. That's the ability to creatively and appropriately solve moral problems in new or complex situations for which experience has not prepared us, and where no rule or function is given in advance. So imagine a situation where competing but incompatible moral values produce what we call wicked moral problems, problems that require tragic choices, where there is no option available to us that will leave us happy and satisfied, but where we nevertheless are forced to act and make a choice that we can justify to others. And unfortunately, humans are forced to make tragic choices all the time, and forced quite often to make moral decisions for which the rules that society has given us do not seem adequate. And we don't yet know what it would mean to engineer a machine that could have practical wisdom, that could solve a moral problem that its training set had never included, that no rule had been provided to guide the solution for, and where no optimal outcome is truly available, and where things that the machine is programmed to preserve cannot all be preserved at the same time. How should a machine like that be designed? Again, this is one of those capabilities that we ourselves struggle to understand how to encourage and foster in our own being. Let me close then this discussion of the unsolved hard problems for machine morality with a quote from the Spark Hunter files. The maker: "You now have a consistent caring. Self-awareness, memory, choice, and now caring. You have the bedrock of personhood." And that will bring us to our next discussion.